everyone, this is Clark Cerullo, and welcome to Tim Nardelli's The Art of Comic Books featuring Night Terror. The featurette you are about to see is a visual documentation of the very process and creation of this comic book page from start to finish, and the conceptualization process that contributed to its very creation. While this feature may not fully delve specifically into the fundamentals or technique towards drawing comics, but it will in fact visually showcase a particular method and approach toward creating comic art from the ground up. If you're wanting to learn how to better draw and paint, especially for comics, there are plenty of good books and online resources that discuss this topic further. Smart devices and apps such as Kindle and iBook have a vast library of good online ebooks for aspiring artists to acquire such desired knowledge towards bettering one's art skills. In fact, YouTube has come to a point now where it has proven to be a very good resource in which to gather necessary information related to the art, as artists from across the world are now able to share their knowledge with others. What's important to remember when watching this feature is to know that the very way in which Tim Nardelli develops comic books may differ from how other professional artists conduct their craft. But everyone has a different method to creating art. The hopes for this feature is to not only show the very process in which the artist created this particular piece from beginning, middle, and end, but to also show you how to create comics. Thank you very much for viewing, and enjoy the feature. Before anything is drawn or illustrated on page, every comic book begins with the most crucial asset, the script. The script in this particular case is written and formatted in a unique way for comics in which describes to the artist, otherwise referred to as the penciler, what is to be visually drawn in each individual panel within the comic book page. In any production, whether it be theater, film, television, or video games, there must always be a script in which tells a story from start to finish. Comic books are no stranger to such process, as the script informs the artist not only what is occurring in each panel on the page itself, but specifically informs the penciler what to draw. Upon the script's completion, the illustrative side comes into fruition. Before diving into drawing and painting the actual comic page itself, it is always advised to create thumbnail images of the actual comic page beforehand. The purpose, like in any field of art, is to obtain a solid understanding of what the overall imagery, composition, and lighting will consist of before investing time and resources towards developing the final product. By taking the necessary time to brainstorm ideas, it provides not only the overall look and imagery within the page itself, but also allows the opportunity to consider the narrative, which will guide the reader in sequential order from the first panel on the page to the very last panel. This process also provides a more solid understanding to the artist in what needs to be drawn, as well as a more accurate scope of the amount of work. These benefits allow affiliates associated with the project, which includes writers, art directors, colorists, and editors, to be able to provide better notes in which can help further refine the art and narrative, which will make the storytelling more sufficient. For example, upon completing the thumbnail storyboard page, it was encouraged by the art director, Ben Ward, to add another panel in between panels 2 and 4 as a means to bridge the transition. By including an additional panel of story within the comic page, helps to not only further convey the main character is having a terrifying nightmare, but the way he awakes from it as well. This helps create a better sense of clarity for the storytelling, making it all the more clearer that the main character is experiencing a horrifying nightmare. With the necessary edits made and applied to the storyboard page, there is now a better understanding of what is occurring in each individual panel, and as a result, a better flow in storytelling is achieved. It goes without saying that taking advantage of constructive criticism and the willingness to collaborate with others goes a long way in achieving quality art. Naturally, changes are bound to occur within any comic book storyboard that are not originally written in the script. This, of course, is certainly not done out of neglect by the writer, but rather a constructive collaboration between the artist, writer, and editor working together to create a solid piece of art. With the additional panel implemented into the comic page, it is necessary for the writer to write the added panel into a script as a means to retain consistency, as well as avoiding confusion in the future as a result of the additional panel. With the quality of the storyboard, from a visual and narrative standpoint figured out, comes the time to consider the color theme and palette in which will encompass the page. Such a task is usually handed off to a colorist, as opposed to the penciler. However, many fine artists and painters will often take the time to produce color studies to get a feel for the color palette they will require in which to apply to their painting. Such is the same for coloring comics. While the color study method is applied here as well, only in this particular case, color is being used as a storytelling medium in which to convey a sense of mood and change of pace as a means to help invoke mood and feeling through color alone. Upon completing and applying the color to the storyboard, an idea instantly presented itself in which to help further convey the main character is having a night terror, particularly in panel 3. In addition to having the extra panel in which transition from the night terror sequences to the real world and the benefits it offers towards the sequential storytelling, another opportunity has presented itself in which to help illustrate the narrative further. In this case, customizing the very picture plane within panel 3. Since this added panel is already intended to visually transition between Matt's night terror into the real world, the artist thought it would be interesting if the border of the picture frame itself were to be grunge-themed, as a means to further convey and show the main character is delirious and his mind is caught in between his subconscious and reality. This is another reason why it's beneficial to do storyboard imagery prior to working on the actual artwork itself, as it better allows the opportunity to come up with creative ideas in which to further develop your art that you originally didn't think of beforehand. With the storyboard now fully realized, a far better and accurate idea is created of which visually shows what the final product should in fact amount to, and what the workload will involve. Tim feels it necessary to visually develop the characters within the comic book from a conceptual standpoint. In this particular case, asking the question, what would these characters look like if they did in fact exist in real life? The protagonist of the story, Matt Deo. When designing and conceptualizing this character, while also taking the story itself into account, it was important to ensure the overall look and impression of a musician was present in the character's very appearance, even at a first glance. When designing characters, the artist tries very hard to make each and every character look as distinguishable from one another, and less generic as possible. In addition to this, Tim's approach towards designing and illustrating characters is to make them look and appear as if they do in fact exist in real life. Considering the artist will be drawing Matt in multiple frames within a single comic page, he always feels it's necessary to really establish what the character will look like from various angles, as well as creating sketch studies that offer visual representations of the character's appearance and personality. The first step in this conceptual phase is to create a model sheet that visually establishes the character's facial features. With a 3/4 portrait painting fully illustrated, which further establishes a particular likeness to the character, makes the drawing process much easier by visually determining what Matt would look like from a front and side profile. The last step in the effort towards visually bringing Matt to reality is producing a 3D model based on the established conceptual drawings. Enter Anton Glukovsky. While providing Anton with the artwork, which establishes the character's appearances, he is better able to create a fully 3D model of the character. The collaboration between both Tim and Anton only further establishes a greater level of realism for the character of Matt Deo. With such visual assets now produced, a level of consistency can be maintained when drawing Matt Deo repeatedly in different panels, frames, angles, and viewpoints. Ultimately, this removes any guesswork when drawing Matt in the comic book. With Matt fully developed visually, the time has now come to apply the same approach to the antagonist of this story, the Demonolith. Unlike Matt, the Demonolith is a fictitious entity that does not exist in nature. This makes the character more challenging to draw, because it is something that does not exist, which is why, as artists, we have both our imagination and creativity to help guide through and overcome such obstacles. To establish the same level of realism for something that does not exist, it requires the same conceptual approach in order to better create the intended vision and clarity to what the demonic figure could possibly look like if it did in fact exist. Before doing any drawing that would suggest structure or design to this creature, it was necessary to create a series of silhouette drawings to help establish a sense of form as a means to further explore possibilities in design. While a design was eventually established, however, like many artists, an artist block came about, in which the artist was uncertain how to take the silhouette design further, which required the aid of an art director to help get the design itself out of the ditch. Enter Mauricio Ruiz. While it took a lot of back and forth between the two artists, however, Mauricio's art direction and guidance made visual development much more efficient, that eventually the two were able to work through and overcome the design flaws that were preventing the demonic creature from being fully realized. Much like what was done in illustrating Matt's model sheet, the same was done for the demonolith. Only in this particular case, it was necessary to showcase the demon's full figure and anatomy. With the overall look and appearance of the demonolith now fully established, the next step in bringing this character to life, like Matt, is to create a 3D model. Enter Kevin Cassidy. With a clear conceptual design fully established, a 3D modeler like Kevin is better able to take the 2D medium, illustrated by Tim, and translate it into a fully 3D model. Since realism is a visual quality for this comic, it was important the same visual aesthetic was applied to the demonolith as well. Like Matt, with the necessary visual assets now fully produced, a level of consistency can be retained by drawing the demonolith repeatedly in different panels, frames, angles, and viewpoints. In this particular case, drawing something as complex as the demonolith, a visual aid such as this goes a long way and makes the job drastically much easier when it comes to drawing this particular character in the comic book. Much like the characters within this comic book, the setting and environments are just as important. Environments within comic books help to further create a setting in which allows the reader to better connect within the world in which these characters live in. The first environment brought to visualization in the comic book was Matt's studio loft. The process of conceptualizing Matt's studio loft involved the same method as previously demonstrated. However, in this particular case, we are designing an environment instead of a character. Perspective plays a huge role in drawing environments for comics. While perspective is certainly a challenging subject to grasp, it is something that should never be neglected either. Much like the storyboard image for this comic, it is always easier to create various thumbnail imagery in order to better conceive the look and feel of the environment. This process allows the freedom to explore ideas without having to get overly focused and stressed on the details and accurate perspective. The goal within this imagery is not only to find an interesting state of composition and lighting, but also to provide enough visual cues that suggest a musician lives within the studio loft, since Matt is a musician. In addition to this, since the story of Night Terror is set in the early 90s, it's very important to be mindful to ensure that everything within the studio loft is historically accurate, given the specific time period. Dude. With the thumbnails completed and reviewed, it was decided to go with option 4 because it has the most interesting composition and offers a better view of the interior. After selecting the thumbnail, it is now time to bring better clarity and rendition to the environment. With a general design and overall understanding of the lighting, composition, and characteristic of the environment, it is much easier to implement a more accurate perspective into the interior. As such, making it easier to decorate the interior based on not only the time period, but Matt's profession as a musician as well. With Matt's studio loft now fully realized and completed, there's a far better understanding as to what the overall look of the environment should consist of, which provides a visual guidance to finding where the character lives. In addition to the benefits towards having such visual assets established, there is a clear and solid understanding as to what the environment should look like from multiple angles. This ultimately eliminates any and all uncertainty. With Matt's studio loft visually established, the next environment to be fully realized is the demonolith's very dwelling in which the demon resides. While there was always a clear understanding in what the demonolith's environment was to look like from a conceptual standpoint, however, Tim felt it was very important to avoid having the environment itself from appearing too religious or biblical. The goal was to avoid putting the overall design into a visual box that would otherwise prevent creativity from taking form. Although appearing as demonic and ominous, it was important the environment did not appear overly hellish, so it was decided by the artist to make the environment itself to look more necro instead. Such a term alone helped pave the way for artistic direction for the demonolith's chilling environment, as well as naming the environment, which came to be known as the necroplane. The same method involving visual development and conceptualization is still applied here. Even though such a chilling environment does not exist in actuality, certainly does not mean we cannot imagine what it would look like if such a place did in fact exist, which is what the world of comic books offers. With a general direction for what the design of the necroplane was to visually look like, it was a matter of finding, much like Matt's studio loft, an interesting composition that would showcase just enough of the environment to suggest the location is certainly a place in which anyone would want to avoid. Having selected the thumbnail, it is now time to bring better clarity to the environment. With the thumbnails completed and reviewed, it was decided to go with option 4, simply because not only does it have the most interesting composition, but it offers an even better view of the environment as well. Since an overall concept has been established in which the necroplane is to look like, it is easier to bring clarity to the final product. As previously stated, while the environment is in fact fictitious, the challenge presented was to take what does not exist in nature and make it look in a way that would suggest otherwise. The key in the design was to make the environment and the architecture within it as nightmare-influenced as possible, while adding a touch of necro quality to the surface of the environment. While a cave setting can tend to be a bit generic when it comes to demonic characters such as the demonolith, however, by including elements that would suggest the necroplane is like an island within a supernatural realm unknown to humanity and science alike, would the environment itself look more distinguished. With the necroplane now fully realized, much like Matt's studio loft, there is a far better understanding as to what the overall look of the environment consists of, as well as providing visual guidance in which the demonic entity resides in. This completes the conceptualization phase of this endeavor, as the next task involves gathering necessary photo references. While the artist does in fact have the necessary conceptual art and visual assets in which to help aid him in illustrating the actual comic page, it does help to have models to pose as a means to provide visual references, of which further aids in the drawing process. It's worth noting that such photographic approach is used among artists across all fields of art. By taking the time to gather the necessary photo references further allows the artist to define the look for the art. True, some artists require photo references while others do not, neither of which are faulted in any regard. And at the end of the day, all artists are in fact different. In the end, it is more about the quality of the finished piece of artwork than it is the method in which one achieves the final look. Within reason, of course. As an artist, Tim ensures that the photo references in which he uses are used only to better understand the subject matter in which he is drawing, and are most certainly not used to trace over photography. As a professional artist, he makes it priority to never trace or project over reference material. What you see is a practice that involves the combination of studying from life, the interpretation from what he sees, and the attempt to draw on paper to the best of his abilities. Nothing more, and most certainly nothing less. With all of the necessary assets now fully accumulated, the artist now has everything needed to begin working on the actual comic page itself. All of the conceptual art here is used to help bring better vision to the final product. The first step towards drawing a page for comic books is to set the canvas up by industry standards, page size 11 by 17. With the advent of technology, artists now have the unique opportunity to draw or paint for comics either traditionally or digitally. When drawing comics, the artist uses art programs such as Adobe Photoshop to draw and paint in order to translate his mark makings through a Wacom Cintiq screen. As an artist, Tim feels that regardless as to whether you create your art through traditional or digital means is irrelevant. What matters the most is what the individual feel most comfortable with and allows you to create your art to its fullest potential. With the canvas fully established, now comes the time to insert the necessary sequential panels within the page as established with the storyboard thumbnail. While all comic artists prep their pages differently, prior to drawing the actual page itself, Tim generally likes to place the storyboard underneath the actual drawing layer as a means to not lose the composition and design of the page layout. In this stage, the artist is only concerned with the various drawings and is not worried about lighting, value, or color. At this particular moment, the artist's only concern is to ensure the quality of the drawing and overall line work simply because it is easier to correct mistakes at this stage as opposed to later on. Upon completion of the drawing phase of the comic page, the artists begin mapping out the shadow shapes within each panel in order to establish and define the separation between light and dark. It should be noted, particularly at this stage, is when an inker would come in to ink the page to further define the definition within the imagery. However, the method in which Tim draws comics is slightly different. With the shadow shapes established within each panel, the artist can then begin to render the imagery by establishing a sense of form and volume in order to convey three-dimensional form and depth on a 2D surface. In this stage, with both the linear and shadow shapes fully established, the artist now attempts to bring a better sense of three-dimensional volume through the means of rendering the forms within the imagery. It is at this very stage where the once flat shapes now become fully rendered. The completion of the black and white rendering leads to a better sense of three-dimensional form within the imagery on a 2D surface. This makes life much easier to apply color on the page, which is the next phase in this process. When it comes to coloring comics, there is indeed multiple methods and techniques in which to apply the application color. The techniques the artist elects to implement color to comics is referred to as the grisaille method. This method is a painting technique when an image is entirely rendered in shades of gray, is previously demonstrated to create the illusion of form to then be applied to translucent oil colors over the monotone underpainting. Personally, the artists prefer this particular approach when it comes to coloring for comics simply because it allows him to develop the foundation of the imagery without having to overly stress about the balances between light, dark, and color theory. Remember the color study Tim had done for the storyboard for this page? This is where such preliminary work comes back into play in being a visual aid towards applying a pre-established color palettes into the final piece. At this stage, with both the linear and shadow shapes fully established, the artist is now attempting to apply color to the black and white rendering by using the grisaille method to an illustration that has established a solid sense of rendering. While the artist is certainly keeping color theory in mind as he is coloring, however, he is also keeping in mind the overall storytelling as well. With this notion in mind, the colors the artist has selected helps to bring a sense of mood and feeling to the story being told. With the coloring now complete, the time has come to move into the final task of this comic, which involves typography. The final phase towards completing this comic page is none other than adding the necessary word balloons and the typography within it. It is at this point where the dialogue, captions, and sound effects that were written into the script are applied to convey the necessary information within each and every panel, all of which contribute toward telling the story from one panel to the next. The visual imagery is intended to be showing the story from panel to panel, while the word balloons and the various other styles of type used for comics are simply used to reinforce the narrative of the story. Through the years, both the methods regarding lettering comics have greatly evolved, as new ways in conveying information within comics have come a long way compared to the early days of comic book publishing. While the need for lettering, like everything else in comics, will always be a necessity, there are always new and exciting ways in which to integrate lettering into comics. This, of course, contributes to a more dramatized narration. This proceeds to conclude the final stage in creating this comic page. And that is how Tim Nardelli makes comics. You have not only witnessed the process in which Tim develops comic books, but have also seen how everything covered in this feature contributes to creating the final product. What should be known is that this is one of many ways in which to create comics from the ground up. This feature was a means to simply share with you and aspiring artists Tim's way and method towards creating comics. Even if you develop your own method of creating comics, which is certainly encouraged, the artist's hope is that this feature has provided you with insight of not only how to create comics, but has also offered you a sense that you too are able to create comics. Regardless if it ranges from writing, penciling, inking, coloring, lettering, or editing, there are indeed possibilities for you as well. and we hope this feature has helped to spark some personal interest towards you pursuing a career in the craft. I'm Clark Cerullo, and we hope you enjoyed the feature, and thank you so much for watching The Art of Comic Books with Tim Nardelli.